Greetings, I'm Makia Moody, Senior Manager with La Piana Consulting, and I am ecstatic about partnering with the Greater New Orleans Foundation on this series, Better Together, Catalyzing Impact Through Strategic Partnerships and Restructuring. This is part of a 3-segment series to share information about the benefits of strategic restructuring, collaboration, and partnerships. Hopefully you've had a chance to watch segment 1, which focused on the collaborative map. This conversation is going to focus on the strategic restructuring process, followed by insights from your own CADA and Jericho Road Executive Directors, Joyce Bracey and Nicole Barnes, who are going to reflect on their strategic restructuring experiences. I've spent 18 years in the nonprofit sector in various roles, and 6.5 of those years, about a third of my career, has been spent in New Orleans. And so that is also contributing to the joy factor of partnering with the Greater New Orleans Foundation on this series. So our topic today and our objective for you is to understand the strategic restructuring process from assessment to integration. And this visual of pulling a rope is supposed to convey that in order to go through the strategic restructuring process, that the individuals that are involved need to be all pulling in the same direction, looking for shared meaning, looking for synergy and alignment. So this visual represents the process, and we are going to take each component from assessment to integration step by step to give you additional insight on what you should be thinking about as you pursue or explore a strategic restructuring. The assessment process can be thought of as an introspective and reflective exercise. So let's begin with self-assessment. When organizations are considering strategic restructuring, it's important to think about your why. Why is it that you would consider, partnering and collaborating in more meaningful ways? And so I want to give you a moment to think about these factors that are laid out here to assess during the self-assessment. The motivators, the desired outcomes. Critical issues would be anything that might be facing your organization that could be a barrier or an impediment to partnering with another organization. Red flags, think of that as any skeletons in the closet for your organization. And then financial assessment, whether or not you have the financial capital and resources to explore and to engage in a strategic restructuring. And so I want to give you a moment to reflect on these factors to assess and to do a little bit of thinking about what your motivators are. What are the desired outcomes that you're driving towards? Are there any critical issues or red flags that are facing your organization that you would need to be really cognizant of before trying to identify potential partners? And so I'm going to give you a moment to reflect on the factors to assess and to jot down a couple of reflections or answers to that particular question. Once you've taken stock of where you are as an organization and completed this self-assessment, it's then time to think about how to identify potential partners. And there are a host of questions that you could ask yourself, that your board could be engaged in as you think about who would potential partners be that would help us to get to the desired outcomes that we just jotted down. And it may be some usual suspects. Perhaps it's organizations you already have a track record of working with, or maybe it's a new organization that has just started, has just began its operations, but there's some synergy that you want to try to maximize or catalyze. And so a couple of the areas that you should consider when identifying potential partners are the following. Are there organizations that are closest to you, whether that is in mission, in how you see the world, how you do your work, or even just geography, like proximity? Are there organizations that where you're serving the same population? And if you were to combine forces or you were to figure out how to collaborate more intentionally, that would have an ultimate benefit for the people that you're serving. It's important to think about where there is complementarity with the programs or services that you're offering. Often the social sector and foundations will speak about the redundancy of organizations, or how there's so many organizations that may duplicate their services or their programming, and that it could be better if there was more alignment and more integration in order to go deeper, instead of just having more breadth in the work that you're doing. And so it's a consideration to think about if there's ways to partner with organizations that are complementary to the work that you're doing, as well as thinking about your overlap with your funders. Sometimes foundations and other funding sources are giving to the same types of organizations, and perhaps there's a better value proposition for those investors and those grant makers if a case can be made for why your organizations would be better together, why you would be achieving accelerated impact, why you would be able to have a depth to your work that doesn't currently exist. And then the last point here is thinking about potential partners from a lens of competition. Are you competing for media attention, or for staff, or for board members? And could you be able to do more better if you were to unite and join forces? And so I want you to, similarly, building upon the information that you jotted down when I asked about your self-assessment questions and your desired outcomes and motivating factors, as you think about these questions about potential partners, do any organizations come to mind that are in your orbit that you would consider engaging as a potential partner? And so take a moment to think about that and write that down as well. Organizations that might make the list of potential partners for you. It's also valuable to think about, once you have your short list of potential partners, what's the criteria that you're going to use to determine whether or not they are indeed a good fit for partnership exploration. And so it's important to think about the level of trust that exists between your organization and theirs. Have your staff already worked together or collaborated on a shared effort? Do your board members know each other? Do you share a program officer at a foundation? Things of that sort. It's important also to, like, if there's past experiences that you have had, to reflect and think about how those were. Was it a good relationship? Was it a strained relationship? If you worked on some joint advocacy together last year, how did it turn out? Did the individuals that were involved keep their word? Were they reliable? Things of that sort. Another area is to think about the usable skills and assets. So as you're thinking about potential partners, you want them to be a value add. You don't want them to drain you of the resources and the energy and the expertise that your organization has. You want them to be a value add and be able to bring something of theirs that will help contribute to the ultimate impact that you're driving towards in the greater New Orleans region. And so usable skills and assets is really taking into account, what is it that this organization would have to contribute in order to grow the pie that is the impact you're trying to have. Usable is in quotations here because sometimes we see that organizations may see the balance sheet for a potential partner and realize that their endowment is, let's say hypothetically, there's a partner organization that has an endowment of $1 billion. And organization A may think that organization's B $1 billion endowment is usable, when in fact, endowments usually have some restrictions and whatnot. And so the usable is here because it's important to make sure that just because the balance sheet is abundant, it may not mean that all of those resources are available or usable should you decide to partner or merge with another organization. And so really kick the tires and understand what's usable and what isn't, as you're considering how to judge whether or not to pursue a partnership with a particular organization. Critically important, the cautions and the challenges. So knowing what's under the hood of an organization when you're considering partnering is important. I suggest looking at their 990s, looking through past media within the last year. Have there been any scandals that the organization has been involved with? What's the general vibe about the organization within the community? Do they have a good reputation? things of that sort. You want to be able to mitigate any risks that could come with being associated or partnering with this organization. And so you really have to kick the tires and lift the hood and ensure that you're walking in with your eyes wide open, that there's not going to be a skeleton that jumps out of the closet and surprises you and your board or your staff. The other component here is around mission and program compatibility. So it's important, if you're trying to reach a desired outcome where there is a shared common goal, it's important that the partner organization also subscribes to that North Star and to that desired outcome. You don't want to be at odds with what it is that you're trying to do and the work that you're trying to move. And so ensuring that potential partners are on board, or that you're able to get on board with whatever it is that's going to be the focus of your organization. And then financial condition, just helpful to know what the numbers say, whether or not they're sustainable, viable financially, et cetera. And so this is in a snapshot of the assessment process. It begins with knowing yourself as an organization and then knowing others. And so I think these are helpful starts to figure out what steps you need to be taking in order to gauge whether or not a particular organization might be a good fit as a partner. And hopefully, as you are writing down your notes, they will be helpful to you as you continue in this process. The next step, so actually, once you finish the assessment, the resolution recognizes that if a strategic restructuring is going to be pursued, that the board needs to adopt a resolution that says so. And typically, these resolutions will say, we, the board of XYZ organization, support the exploration of a strategic partnership with X organization up to and through a merger. And we expect that this exploratory process will last for the next 6 months. So it's important for the resolution to be time bound so that when we get into negotiation and start to think through with your potential partner, if there's a there, it's important to have some guardrails around the timing so that you can know like how you are moving the work forward and having the conversations that you need to have to determine whether or not the organization is indeed a match. And so the negotiation process is also, I would say, time intensive. There are a number of areas that need to be interrogated and assessed. And so this chart provides you with a Cliff Notes version of that. And so issues to negotiate during the negotiation process include governance. But I would say even before getting to governance, it's important to see if there's mission complementarity. What might a shared mission look like for organization A and organization B? How are they going to take the best of both organizations to then create something that's really powerful for the future? And so getting clear on alignment with programming is critical, mission, vision, values, things of that sort. Where's the alignment? Where's the integration? The governance model will change because this will ultimately be a change to the corporate structure and to the decision-making for the entity that comes out on the other side of the negotiations process. And so it's important for there to be discussion about how the governance model is going to work, which board members from organization A and organization B are going to be a part of the next chapter's board. Financial considerations. So what might a shared budget look like between the two organizations? Where are the investments going to be as you think about staffing? If there are two chief financial officers, how does that shake out? How are you going to leverage the expertise of both? Or how do you determine which one will perhaps take on a different role in the organization? There's lots of considerations related to the financial implications of potentially merging, human resources, capital, if you own any buildings or real estate, things of that sort. And then communications is important both internally and externally. We know that sometimes the M word, merger, can be anxiety inducing because it signifies change. It might be rapid change. There may be a connotation that everyone that is in both organizations is not going to remain employed. Like there's a whole narrative that's sometimes behind the idea of a merger. And so communicating internally to staff as this process is underway is critical, as well as once there's been a decision made for the organizations to merge, that there's an external plan for communications so that your participants and clients, your funders, the community at large, that people understand what has happened and what the desired outcomes are. What's the rationale? What's the case for the strategic restructuring in the first place? It's important to be able to communicate that so that the stakeholders within your community are able to, you know, celebrate this decision and or support you in new and deeper ways. So what typically takes place during the negotiation process is that there are 2 committees from each of the organizations. And so from this graphic, you can see that the Corporation A and Corporation B each have a subset of board members from their boards of directors that form a negotiations committee. And the charge of the negotiations committee, which would have been outlined in the resolution adopted by the board, and each of the organizations that might be coming to the table to negotiate, both of their boards need to adopt a board resolution that has similar language because you're working towards the same end, that outlines what the task and expectation is for this negotiations committee. And so you can see here that the task is for the negotiations committee to negotiate the issues that were on the preceding slide, which I will go back to in a moment, and to go through the due diligence process. So financial due diligence, legal due diligence, really making sure that everything is above the board and the board members and executive leadership have all the information they need to make an informed decision about whether or not to take this leap and embark upon a strategic restructuring. And so once there is a decision from, you know, Corporation A and Corporation B related to going through the resolution, this negotiations committee is formed. And this is where a lot of the work happens that is here. So what's taking place within that negotiations committee? The negotiations committee is coordinating with attorneys. So there are legal implications to all of this. So it's critical to have legal advice. The negotiations committee is working through some of these meaty issues that they've just negotiated. So what is our governance structure going to be? What's our financial model going to be in the future? What kind of decisions do we need to make about the programs that we are going to retain and the programs that we are going to sunset if they are no longer relevant and mission-centric to what it is that we're creating for the future? Talking through financial due diligence and ensuring that there is like compensation parity. I've worked on mergers where one organization had a very rich benefits package and the salary bands were very different from the organization that they were about to merge with. And so there was an exercise that involved human resource consultants to really streamline and get rid of the disparities between the 2 organizations. Because if you are going to take organization A and organization B and create something new, there needs to be parity within the compensation structure. There needs to be parity in how staff are going to be able to achieve promotions, like what are the promotion pathways in the new entity. All of these things need to be noted so that they can be kind of worked through in the further phases of implementation and integration. Communication strategy. So what is it that the negotiation committee is going to be communicating as the process unfolds? Crisis management potentially, as well as keeping the board updated on what's happening within the negotiations committee. And so all of this is a lot of work and a lot of conversation and deliberation. And it's important to track the agreements and the decisions that the negotiation committee is making so that there's clarity and transparency about what's been decided and what still needs to be decided. And that also helps inform each of the respective boards that is ultimately going to be presented with a recommendation from the negotiations committee. So within that, it's a pretty full menu of discussion topics over the 4 to 6 months of negotiations that might be underway for a strategic restructuring. The timeline actually depends on the, I guess, availability of who's on the negotiations committee and perhaps some other factors. There might be a more accelerated timeline in the event that there is a crisis that one of the organizations is working through. But it's just important to have a very clear framework for how you are going to move through this process to ensure that you're not missing any of the key questions that need to be resolved in order to make an informed decision about whether or not to merge or develop a parent subsidiary or another type of strategic restructuring. Due diligence is critical in that it provides insight to a lot of the nuts and bolts that are going to have implications for the future. And so financial due diligence is an exercise where the financials for each of the organizations are kind of like sifted through to see where there are gaps and where there are commonalities. My colleagues that conduct the financial due diligence usually do a budget comparison to see, what are the financial underpinnings for organization A and organization B? Is one heavily reliant on state dollars and the other is more reliant on private dollars or earned revenue? What does that mean for the future of the programming that this new entity wants to deliver? What does it mean for the risk in the event that some of those public funding streams dry up? And so financial due diligence creates the opportunity to see in a very clear and concise way what the financial realities are for each organization, and then to make decisions and ask questions about how to basically, I would say, integrate or mesh those financial plans so that they do help to drive towards whatever the desired outcomes are that were agreed to at the start of the negotiations process. Legal due diligence is also critical in that organizations can be structured very differently. If a membership organization is going to merge with a non-membership organization, like what are the legal implications there that need to be assessed by a legal mind with some recommendations. There's also legal implications for the articles of incorporation or what your state might require as you incorporate a new entity, et cetera. And so the legal due diligence is also important for the future, as well as looking back to ensure that there aren't any pending lawsuits or legal challenges that are going to need to be assessed and or resolved before a merger or a strategic restructuring can happen. And so due diligence is really, I like to think of them as research projects where there's some key financial questions that the committee is going to grapple with and make sense of. And then with the legal due diligence, it's really ensuring that the T's are crossed, the I's are dotted, so that the organization that is being birthed through this process is able to get a good start should the board say, yes, we want to merge and agree to merge. So once all of those issues are negotiated and the legal due diligence and the financial due diligence has been completed, and the negotiations committee is excited to say, yes, we want to pursue this strategic restructuring, the negotiations committee will go back to, they'll go back to their respective boards with a recommendation from the committee. Should each board say, yes, we want to pursue this path to a strategic restructuring, that is when implementation planning gets underway. And implementation planning is critical. It's like the plan before the plan, in a sense. And it requires staff engagement and staff input because it's essentially laying the groundwork and the building blocks for how to get to integration. And so implementation planning is critical and requires a lot of forethought about all of the different areas that are going to require attention as you move from organization A plus organization B, creating organization C. So thinking about implementation, there are a couple of areas that require attention, and the implementation options really depend on, I think, how it is that the organization wants to be structured once it decides that a merger is the type of opportunity that it's going to pursue. The implementation process itself has a host of, I guess, kind of boxes to check as you are thinking about how to move forward with making the aspiration for a merger or strategic restructuring come to fruition. And so within the planning realm, there are operational and program plans that need to be developed. It's essentially, this is the part of the process where all of the discussion that the negotiations committee had and kind of cooked up as far as the aspirations and the hopes and the dreams for this partnership, the implementation process is where like pen hits paper to really determine how are we going to resource this, how are we going to build this in order to make those aspirations and those visions real. And so strategic plans, business plans, thinking about how change management and culture management need to happen. This is a transformative process for all who are involved. And so the planning element is critical and requires a significant amount of attention and time. Legal resolution is also important. So thinking about the state requirements that impact organizations when they are created. Your state would need to formally approve after you filed your articles. They need to approve it. They might have questions, et cetera. And so you need these like incorporation documents that will be developed and submitted. And then after the legal resolution, it typically says like when the organizations will begin partnering for real. And so you'll begin operating as partners. Once that light switch is flipped to say that you are now, you've made it to the altar, you've gotten married, you are partnering until death do us part, then the integration process begins, which really calls into question every nook and cranny of an organization. So you think about your systems, you think about your databases, you think about your policies and practices like human resource policies, all of the things. Administrative, there's elements there. Programmatic, so how is it that you are going to rethink your programmatic assessment and evaluation now that your programmatic portfolio has shifted and evolved? How are you going to communicate those changes to your participants and your clients? And then people and culture, which is really important considering that this is ultimately a change management process. So we've often found that with integration, the pitfalls can be many, but sometimes the more transactional components or more operational components, like integrating your database or integrating your financial system, is the easier part compared to thinking about how to integrate and merge cultures. Individual cultures, because, you know, having worked in a number of nonprofits, there's a certain DNA and a certain vibe that organizations have. And so when you introduce a new organization or new ways of being and doing, there can sometimes be challenges and fissures, or there can be excitement about building something new and perhaps building it back better. And so mergers can fail because people tend to hold on to their individual cultures as an organization or individual preferences and the identity of the organization rather than create a new organization. And so we like to suggest when organizations are considering, you know, cultural integration and things of that sort, to really be clear on how is it that you are going to bring the best of organization A and the best of organization B, and also at the same time create new practices and new routines and new rituals for this new entity that you've just birthed. Often there are organizations that tend to hold on to, we've always done it this way. But there needs to be a new way if you've just decided to strategic restructure and create something new. And so it's an opportunity to, I think, start from a blank slate. And so as you think about what we've shared thus far and the different phases for the negotiations process, I am curious for you as you think about whether or not strategic restructuring might be the right path or course of action. When you think about the assessment phase and the negotiation phase and the implementation and integration phases, which one gives you the most pause? Where do you think that there might be more barriers for you and your organization if you were to start this journey? Would it be thinking about the self-assessment? Would it be identifying potential partners? Would it be actually getting your subset of the board and the potential partners board to like form a negotiations committee and wrestle with some of those key questions? Or would it be the implementation and integration phase? And so based on what I've shared, I will pause for you to think about which area of this process might be the most challenging as you consider what's possible for your organization. And feel free to write it down so that you can refer back to it. Okay, so I have alluded to the amount of work that it takes when you consider a strategic restructuring. And the good news is that we have a lot of examples where organizations have successfully merged, they've successfully partnered, and have achieved success. And so some of the success factors are reflected here. Mission, focus, and alignment, critical. If you are not aligned on the core substance of why your organization exists, then there will be challenges. Flexibility in pursuing mission. So being flexible or adaptable is valuable in a number of instances, specifically when we see it between organizations where there may be different approaches to program delivery, for example, and yet the outcome that they're anticipating for the youth or the students they're serving is the same. And so while they're not exactly cookie cutter in their approach, there is some flexibility in how they're doing the work to reach the same destination. And so it's helpful to approach some of this with a little bit of malleability, I guess. It's also valuable and a success factor, when organizations are not in an immediate crisis. I've mentioned that this process takes time, it takes focus, it takes attention. And so not having the additional stress of being in crisis allows for that energy to be used to be thoughtful and proactive in this process. A lack of divisiveness. It's important to, I think, figure out how to coalesce and be clear on what the shared outcomes are and what the shared expectations are as you are considering a strategic restructuring. And so if there is an instance between, let's say, organization A's board and organization B's board, where it's clear that there's some type of friction, I suggest really digging deep on what that friction is before getting too far along in the process. Because you don't want something that wasn't nipped in the bud at the beginning to then become something that's insurmountable 2 months into the negotiations process. And so really trying to ensure that there isn't a lack of divisiveness and that there's clarity about what it is that you're driving towards. And then the last point here is like risk taking and growth orientation. So one success factor, since this is somewhat new terrain for organizations to think about what they might be giving up or what they might be gaining by considering a strategic restructuring, requires a little bit of a growth mindset and a growth orientation. I think often as humans, we are conditioned to think about what is and not what can be. And one of the success factors is being able to focus on what can be. As you think about, who fits the criteria as an organization to be a potential partner that will help you do more, do better, and serve the community that you are here to serve. And so as you look at these success factors, I am curious and invite you to reflect on which of these success factors do you think is already something that you have as an asset when you think about where your organization is right now. So when we went through the exercise of potential partners earlier, do you already have positive relations with potential partners that may have made your shortlist? Is it that your organization's not in an immediate crisis and you have the luxury and the opportunity to really think about the future in the long term and how you might be able to deepen your impact? Is it that you have, an internal champion who has been beating this drum about strategic restructuring for the last 2 years, and now it seems like the right time given where we are? And so I will pause for you to reflect on which of these success factors you already have at your disposal as you consider strategic restructuring. And I encourage you to write it down. So though I said that achieving success is possible with proactive work and intention and attention, there are some roadblocks. And so it's helpful to know what those roadblocks are so that you can be really more prepared to mitigate them should they pop up. So autonomy concerns. Often organizations are they're deeply rooted in their legacy, their brand, how they've been making decisions for X number of years. And so sometimes one roadblock is that autonomy is going to shift. And in a strategic restructuring, there is a shift in the locus of control, whether that's that the governance board is going to be merging or changing, or what have you. And so autonomy over decision making, as well as like brand identity, can sometimes be a roadblock that should be addressed head on. Self-interest, often, ego can sometimes get in the way of making progress on things that are important, or an individual may be thinking about what's in it for me instead of what's in it for the organization and for the people that we are here to serve. And so it's important to think about how to respond to self-interest when and if it emerges, which I often suggest just being really focused on like the higher level of what it is that you're trying to achieve. So going back to your why, going back to the desired outcomes, which I guarantee are bigger than any one individual, and reminding people of that. Too much talking, not enough doing. Sometimes if there's not strong facilitation, possibly through a consultant, possibly through someone else, there can be a lot of navel gazing and discussion without actually getting to action. Sometimes organizations have a hard time separating activity from accomplishment. And in this instance, if an organization or a negotiations committee is thinking about merging and yet the plane just never lands, then that can be a challenge and a barrier. And so it's important to have a clear process. It's important to be able to show the negotiations committee and the organization's respective boards how the process is moving along and what the milestones are, like what decisions have been made. That's why the tracking of the agreements is so important, because it gives you a data set to show what the progress is that's been made with the negotiations committee, because there are a whole host of issues to negotiate and resolve. And so you need to take them one by one and work through them. And the tracking of the agreements is a helpful tool in order to see where you're making progress, what you've actually been able to cross off the list, and where you still need to dig in. The board has a unique role to play in strategic restructuring. So as you know, the board's primary role as a governing body is to provide strategic direction, to provide oversight and support of the chief executive, there's a whole host. I'm thinking of Board Source's 10 basic roles and responsibilities for boards. Specifically in strategic restructuring though, there is an engagement that goes from like low to high, depending on maybe like where your organization is and what the appetite of your board is. But ultimately, the board will need to approve a final agreement related to strategic restructuring. Staff also have a unique role to play in strategic restructuring as collaborators and thought partners. When you think about the proximity that staff have to the individuals that are being impacted day to day by the organization, by the inner operations and the operational or financial or programmatic infrastructure that really undergirds the organization, staff have key insights that will be necessary to help move this process along and really, truly help the implementation planning process to go well. They can spot things that, at the board level may be amiss. And so it's important to engage staff when the time is right, when the board has said, yes, we are going to proceed in this direction. Implementation planning is really where staff are able to roll up their sleeves and dig in to start to set up what needs to be set up so that the operational underpinnings that are required to make integration work are in place. So a few key reminders in thinking about strategic restructuring and all of the possibilities that were shared on the collaborative map. There's more than one partnership that might meet your needs as an organization. So it's important to know your why and then develop or choose a partnership option that meets that why. Form follows function, essentially. That partnerships take time and capacity. So these are relationships that need to be, the seed needs to be planted, the soil needs to be watered. Once the plant starts to grow, it needs more sunlight. Like it's not a one and done type of experience, but partnerships take time to cultivate, and relationship management is critical. A strong process will provide confidence and structure. So I've mentioned how many things there are to keep track of and to consider as you are going through the strategic restructuring process, from assessment to integration. And it can be valuable to offload some of that project management and guidance to a consultant who has the expertise and the competence and the background in strategic restructuring to help shepherd the process and keep the trains running on time. And last but not least, it's important to remember that we are a people-centered sector. And so it's important to be thoughtful about what is the impact emotionally, psychologically, economically, all the dimensions. What is the impact of this decision for strategic restructuring on our respective staffs? And how is it that we are going to be sure we are being thoughtful about how to bring them along in this change management process? And so just remember the people, be human-centered as you think about these questions and what's possible as you try to pursue a strategic restructuring. If you want to learn more about this series or about other offerings from GNOF's Nonprofit Leadership and Effectiveness team, I encourage you to contact Kelly Chavez Green, Director, Nonprofit Leadership and Effectiveness, or visit their website to see what offerings are coming your way. I also encourage you to reach out to me if you have questions about this presentation and want to make another reminder for segment 3, Lessons from the Field, where you will have the opportunity to hear from the executive directors from CADA and Jericho Road as they reflect on their strategic restructuring experiences. Thank you so much.